Okay, a very quick tutorial on how I would do pot bunkers. So first thing is you don't actually want them to be very big. So we tended to go about 5 yards. This would have been some of the bigger ones. In actual fact, you also don't want to go too far down. With the sculpting, the tricky bit is getting the sand dead flat. I might go, let's say 2 feet for a first flat and roughly work out where this is. Give it one click and then I'd scale it back up to 0 and triple click or so here, and you'll see that it just keeps flattening out a little bit more until it gets to a point where you can see that it's doing this but it's not actually affecting anything. So that's kind of your base. What you then need to do is soften, but you can see it's still in a little bit of a bowl. So like when we were doing that triple click, you can see the land wants to go down, but it's just not quite doing it. So we need to trick the game a little bit. So you take the oval brush, this one. The reason we choose this one is because you've got the most fuzziness in this bit, so we're going to use that pointier edge a little bit more, and we're just going to take it out and just keep triple clicking, and slowly this does actually take the edges down a bit more. So we'll do a bit more. Now you can see you do get some crinkling, so you've got that little line popping in. If we zoom in again, you'll see that just there. Kind of unavoidable. You can soften it, you can redo it. Sometimes also what we found with Ainsdale is that some of these look better in certain directions than others. In the end, what I started doing with the later ones that I did on that course, so I don't know, probably around like the 15th hole was one of the latest ones I did, or the second, was making the bunkers a little bit wider than I thought I had to. I then went into splines, make it pretty narrow, and I would just do like a small 4-pointed square. The good thing with splines is, so we're going to look to cover roughly the X that we've got. You might fill it and then it suddenly leaps out. The good thing with splines is you can then adjust it and just get it exactly where you want it to be. I would tend to go with that little square shape at the start because that's going to give you the most likelihood of getting a circle when all is said and done. So getting it roughly to these edges as much as we can without it creeping up. You can see it's starting to do that just a little. And if you've kept that cross shape, you're going to still have a rough idea of where this edge is. If you want to, you can smooth the corners. Sometimes makes it a bit bigger, sometimes it doesn't. I tend not to. I don't really see it making much difference. Now, at the moment I'm finding with this one that's about as close as I can get. I can see this bit's a little high up. You then do kind of the final step you want is bunkers sort of auto sculpt in this game. You can see the middle is a little lower, so we're just going to reverse that process. If you can see the middle is the lowest part of the bunker and this is around about the normal height we'd want, well, we're going to reverse that by having the middle of our raised brush and just bring it up roughly to the surface. Now you can do it with maths and go it's like 9 or 10. I just do it by sight and give it one click, and I might just do some final little raises around the sides just where I know that the sand isn't quite level, and that it's not 100% perfect, but it's pretty good for what we want. And also, especially in this version, given that the lie grid doesn't exist, definitely helps. Now the final thing I'd do on its own, this doesn't look that menacing. What you really want to do is start raising around the outside. So the key thing here is to make sure that the edge of this blue brush never overlaps the sand that you've built, because if you've spent time flattening that, don't undo it. And here just a couple of raises, do it in increments, don't do, again I would do it by sight, but generally not more than about a foot at a time, because then that can start tearing the land. And one of the things I liked doing on Ainsdale was giving a real kind of, there's one side where you want it to be highest, which is generally facing direction of play, so towards the green, and I'd try to crown that side. So like, let's say this is our high point right about there, and then we make everything fall off that. You can also, up to you, some pots will be completely submerged. I like Oh, that's a bad one. You can see that the brush is overlapping. So you need to make that a bit smaller. Again, go back to your overhead if you're not sure. Some pots might be complete. I tend to still like, even with these, when you won't necessarily see the base of the sand, I like you to see roughly where the bunker is. So I would still be dipping the land just in front of it. You can do it with any brush you want. Probably, to be honest, this one's your best bet. But I think for me the key is when you're messing around with most of these bunkers, might lower again, and then when you're further away from it, maybe use flatten, because you can do that, and we've got ourselves something that looks pretty serviceable. You can also check the height if you want. 3 feet's pretty good. If you can get it to 4, I wouldn't go much more than that. And you can also use this to check to what extent do we need to raise or lower. But I think don't get overly picky on this. It's not something we can necessarily get perfect, or indeed that people can necessarily check in this game. So I think here, if you see where the thing is rising up, probably gotten a little bit close for some of my sculpting at the top. You can lower it, and you'd think this would work, but it does tend to make it a little bit crinkly. So honestly, the best way is probably at this point to raise the middle of the sand a little bit more. Yeah, something like that, and then bizarrely we've actually gone down a little bit more. It's a bit finicky. I would still suggest doing it by eye more than anything. So for example with that one, I've decided to raise here because I noticed that coming down here it was getting a little bit, and you can see it's better, but here was a drop of 0.4, it's now a drop of 0.2. 0.3 in the middle, so that's a tiny bit lower. So I might do exactly the same raise again, slightly off center. Let's go up by 4 and see what that does. Yeah, I mean that's probably as good as we'll get, and then maybe lower this bit a touch. Let's change to a different brush. But honestly, the more you are doing this little stage at the end, generally the worse I found it got. I think if you can just do it relatively quickly at the start, so we'll clear our markers now, that'd be pretty good. Now, based on your fairway, the other thing I'd be wary of when you're doing greens and fairways with these, just run your fairway a decent amount around them, because you're going to want this to be heavy rough in order for it to really stand out. We did paint them with light rough, I think, on Ainsdale, but yeah. And I guess the last thing is, you wouldn't necessarily want, if you're putting them up against a green, I think you'd need to leave about that much just for your sculpting to work, and really have them protecting the green by the bunker coming down into it. If you look at Birkdale, if you look at Lytham, some of the other links, you'll see that they do protrude into greens as slopes. So anyway, hope that helps. Good luck.